I didn't cry at my father's funeral, not because I didn't feel anything, but because I felt too much. How do you mourn a man who gave you everything, except himself? He died alone, in a mansion filled with gold and silence, heavy chandeliers, Persian rugs, luxury that felt more like punishment. No friends, no family, not even a photo by his bedside. Just the sterile hum of machines. And an envelope with my name on it. We hadn't spoken in 17 years. He missed my graduation. He missed my wedding. He even missed the call when I told him he was going to be a grandfather. And now the world called him a genius, a self-made man, a visionary. But those people never saw the empty chair at our dinner table. They never heard my mother crying behind the bathroom door. For years, I told myself I didn't need him, that I was fine without him. But standing in that cold museum of marble and echoes, I realized something that shattered me. He may have died alone, but a part of me had died long before he did. And then I opened the envelope. Inside was something strange, a name, a key, and a message that flipped everything I thought I knew, about him and about myself. But before I show you what he left behind, you need to understand who he really was. The man behind the fortune, the father behind the distance, the silence behind our story. If you've ever loved someone who didn't know how to love you back, or if you've ever felt invisible in your own home, stay with me. This story might not heal you, but maybe, just maybe, it'll make you feel less alone. The house hadn't changed, not in the way that mattered. The hedges had gone wild, and the paint on the shutters peeled in long, curling strips like dead skin. But that wasn't what caught in my throat. It was the silence. Not the peaceful kind you get in the country, the hush of trees and the whisper of wind through grass, but a heavier thing, the kind of silence that knows your name and waits for you like it's been sharpening its teeth. 17 years gone, and the front door still groaned the same way when I pushed it open. Dust had claimed the corners like a second skin. The air tasted stale, brittle. I paused in the threshold, not because I needed a moment, but because I couldn't make myself take the next step. It hit me all at once. The weight of it. The absence. You think you've grown out of things. Grief, rage, the raw ache of a child abandoned. But when I saw the table set, saw the 3 places laid with deliberate care, and his chair empty, it all came crawling back. That chair, pushed, neatly under the table like someone still cared about the impression it made, like someone still hoped he'd come home. He wouldn't. We all knew that. The dining room was too clean. It reeked of my mother's quiet rituals, of a woman keeping order because she couldn't keep anything else. Somewhere in the house I heard her sob. Not the open cry of fresh grief. This was older, deeper, a habit of sorrow that had worn grooves into her bones. She didn't come to greet me, just stayed behind the bathroom door, dissolving in pieces. And there it was, on the hallway floor. White envelope. My name in that impossible handwriting, tight, formal, like it was afraid to feel anything. I picked it up, and the world narrowed. He'd written to me, after everything, after leaving, after silence and questions that burned, holes in my ribs. I didn't open it. Not yet. I tried calling. Stupid. Pathetic. I stared at the number before pressing it, my thumb trembling like I was 14 again, waiting for a voice I knew wouldn't come. The line rang, and rang, and when the voicemail kicked in, I hung up before the beep. What would I even have said? The house felt colder now. The kind of cold that wasn't temperature, it lived in the bones of the place. My chest ached. Not like heartbreak, not even like grief. It was something deeper. A pressure, like a stone had taken residence under my ribs and refused to move. I leaned against the wall, the envelope crumpling slightly in my hand, and whispered the question I'd never dared say aloud before. How do you forgive a man who never loved you? The silence didn't answer. It never had. The letter wasn't long, but it took me an hour to read. Not because of the words. They weren't difficult. But the handwriting. God, the handwriting. I'd known it once, back when I still believed in bedtime stories and a father who came home smelling of books and whiskey. Now it looked like a ghost had written it, shaky, hesitant, like even the ink was afraid of what it had to say. It started like a confession. Not the clean, redemptive kind, the kind priests hope for. No, this was messier, splintered. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't apologize. He just opened up, as if he'd been carrying this rot in his chest for decades and finally couldn't bear the weight of it anymore. He spoke of a woman I never met, a name I'd never heard. Eva. My mother's name is not Eva. He wrote of nights lost in cities I'd only seen in glossy travel brochures. Berlin, Kyoto, Cairo. But not as a tourist. He described them like old lovers, familiar and treacherous. There were betrayals there, ones that haunted him. A man named Calder, who he said had once been his brother in all but blood. A daughter who never made it to her second birthday. That one hit me like a punch to the ribs. He said he kept it from us, me and my mother. Not to protect us, but because he couldn't bear to be that man in our eyes. Weak. Wrecked. I should have hated him for that. For the cowardice. For the choices made in smoky bars and faceless hotel rooms while I waited at the window every Christmas Eve. But instead, I felt something worse. I understood him. Or I wanted to. Is that weakness? Is that what runs in the blood too? The letter spiraled, as if he lost control halfway through. He spoke of shadows watching him, of names that changed every time he tried to write them. A company, Rosenhart, mentioned, only once underlined so hard it tore the paper. He said they don't forgive loose ends and that by the time I read this he'd either be dead or elsewhere. That word again, elsewhere, like a bad magician's trick. And then right at the end, the part that hasn't stopped echoing since. If you want the truth, follow the coordinates I left in the clock. It's all there. What I did, what they made me do, and what I tried to bury. You'll hate me for it, you should. The envelope crinkled in my hands. I turned it over again and again like it could tell me something more. He wasn't the man I thought he was. Not the father who disappeared. Not the genius the world praised. He was something else entirely. Something broken, maybe dangerous. And, now with shaking hands, I stood facing the grandfather clock in the hallway. Tick, tock, the mask was off. But did I really want to see the man beneath? The trail he left behind wasn't a straight line. It twisted, looped, vanished into shadow like he wanted to be followed but not found. I drove through rain so thick it blurred the road and made the headlights feel like ghosts. First stop. A former colleague. Then a woman with too soft eyes and too much history. Each encounter felt like peeling back old wallpaper only to find something rotting beneath. None of them gave me the man I remembered. To one, he was brilliant and charming, the kind of man who made you feel like you mattered until he decided you didn't. To another, he was cruel, casually so, the kind of cruelty that wore a smile and used words like scalpels. I listened, took notes, nodded in all the right places. But something in me shriveled each time a new version was laid bare. It was like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle, only the pieces came from different boxes. Some showed a man who loved deeply. Others, a manipulator who bent everyone around, him like wire. I thought I'd feel closer to him by doing this, by retracing his steps, hearing his name in other people's mouths. But instead I felt like a voyeur at my own father's funeral, watching a stranger get buried over and over. The worst came from her. Her name was Morella. She used to come around when I was a kid, always with a scarf wrapped tight around her neck, too much perfume, and a laugh that never reached her eyes. She made tea without asking, poured it like it was a ritual, told me he was good at hiding what he didn't want you to see. He never loved cleanly, she said. Everything with him was a transaction, even kindness. It landed like a slap. I didn't react, not outwardly, but inside something cracked. Back at the house, I found the box. tucked behind insulation in the attic like a secret too heavy to carry. Photos, letters, some addressed to other women. One to my mother, never sent. A bracelet I didn't recognize. A child's drawing, my name on it, but in someone else's handwriting. I sat there surrounded by the detritus of a man I'd spent my life trying to become. And the thing is, I didn't feel betrayed. Not really. I felt emptied, because maybe I'd built him in my head. Maybe I'd only ever known the father I wanted to believe in. The mirror shattered that night. Not literally, though I did stare into it long enough to wonder if it might crack under the weight of what I saw. My face, his face, flickering like something haunted. I thought about my mother, what she'd endured in silence, what she'd buried for my sake, or maybe for her own. And I asked myself, out loud, like some kind of prayer, how do you rebuild your identity when everything you believed was a lie? No answer came. Just my own reflection staring back like it didn't know me either. I drove back from the house with my knuckles white on the steering wheel, headlights slicing through the black like they were hunting something I couldn't name. The silence in the car was too loud, pressing, echoing. My thoughts came in static bursts, tangled and broken, like an old radio trying to tune into a station that didn't exist anymore. My mother had finally spoken. Not in soft, evasive murmurs like she used to, but in sharp, metallic words that cut as they landed. She sat in that sagging kitchen chair like it was a throne of bones, eyes dull, voice brittle with time, and she told me things I hadn't asked to know. She told me about the long nights, how he would disappear, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, how he came home smelling like other lives, how she stopped asking where he'd been because the answers were worse than the questions. How once when I was 7 she found him crying in the garage, fist clenched around a photograph that wasn't of us. And then she said something that snapped the air in two. You were never enough for him, but you were all I had. I don't know if that was meant to be comfort or confession, maybe both, maybe neither, but it landed heavy. It burrowed deep. I remembered the way I used to stare at his chair at the table, the way I'd pretend he was just running late, caught in traffic, not gone, not like that. And I remembered the way my mother would tighten her jaw and clear the plates without saying a word. That silence, it wasn't passive. It had teeth. It shaped me. I didn't realize until that night just how much. I started seeing it everywhere. In the way I pull away from people without meaning to. In the way I listen for footsteps that never come. In the way I mistake quiet for safety and distance for control. That kind of absence doesn't just leave a hole, it builds a map. A way of walking through the world that always leads you back to empty. I tried to forgive him. I tried to believe that maybe he was just broken, not cruel. But the truth is, you can only stretch yourself so far before you snap. That night I lay awake in my childhood bed, the room smaller than I remembered. The shadows stretched long and thin on the ceiling like they were reaching for me. I dreamt of him, not the real him, but the ghost I built to survive. He stood at the edge of a field looking away, never turning back. I screamed his name, but the wind took it. When I woke, the pillow was damp and my hands were clenched around nothing. The distance between us didn't kill him, but it was killing me. The attic wasn't locked, but it might as well have been. I hadn't set foot up there since I was 10. Since he still lived here, still whistled tunelessly while shaving and smelled like sweat and expensive aftershave. My mother always kept it clean but never used it, as if even she understood it wasn't really part of the house anymore. The air hit me like a memory, dry, thick, tinged with dust and the sharp bite of old wood. I pulled the cord on the naked bulb and watched the light flicker once, twice, then settle into a weak amber glow. The box was where I somehow knew it would be. Behind an old trunk of coats we hadn't worn since the 90s, under a moth-eaten blanket that looked like it belonged to someone else's childhood. It wasn't labeled. Of course it wasn't. Inside folders, yellowed papers, Polaroids that bent when I touched them, like they flinched from being seen, and a black plastic cassette case, scratched and worn, like someone had held it too tight for too long. I stared at it for a full minute. My heart hadn't beat right since I opened the box. A steady thump of dread and something else. Anticipation, maybe. The recorder was in the same box. Batteries corroded. I replaced them with some from the kitchen drawer, half expecting the thing to explode in my hand. I pressed play. His voice. Low, controlled, measured like a confession he wasn't quite ready to give. I know you'll find this someday. Maybe I want you to. Maybe that's all I've ever wanted. Someone to see the truth and not flinch. The recording went on. Names. Places. Things that should have stayed buried. Deals made behind closed doors and paid for in silence. He wasn't just a father who left. He was a man carrying a double life like a second skin. Affairs. Money passed under tables. A connection to a death we were told was an accident. And the trauma. His own. Things done to him. Things he passed on without even knowing. A cycle repeating, in quiet acts. A slap too hard, a silence too long, a distance too vast for a child to cross. I listened to the whole thing twice. Then I threw up. I didn't cry. That came later, when the rage dulled and something hollow took its place. This wasn't abandonment. It wasn't simple cowardice. It was a man at war with himself. A man who thought disappearing might be the only good thing he ever did for us. I sat there for hours, sifting through everything. Documents with names I didn't recognize, photos with faces I barely remembered. Each new truth tugged at the puzzle of my memory, shaking loose things I'd packed away. The picture that emerged was grotesque and human and broken. I kept asking myself, does the truth heal? Or does it just show you how deep the wound really goes? The truth didn't fall like a hammer. It seeped in, slow and quiet, curling around my ankles like cold fog until I looked down one day and realized I was standing knee-deep in it. That's how it works, I think, when the truth's been buried for too long. It doesn't explode, it exhales. It started with a name. Someone my father once worked with, Martin Kerr, a man whose voice sounded like ash and gravel when he picked up the phone. He hesitated when I said who I was. I could hear the pause, the inhale. Not surprise. Recognition. Guilt, maybe. Or just the sound of something unspoken trying to get loose. We met in a pub that smelled of damp coats and burnt coffee. He looked older than I expected, though maybe I was just still seeing my father's youth through the wrong lens, imagining him as he was before he left, not how he aged without me. Martin didn't say much at first, just sipped his pint and studied the ring his glass left on the table. But then he told me stories, not the kind people usually share at funerals or in family photo albums. These weren't softened by time or sentiment. There were debts, bad choices, nights that disappeared into fog and whiskey. My father had walked out, yes, but long before he ever packed a bag, he'd already left in 100 smaller ways. Bit by bit, until there was nothing left but his name in the house and his silence in our lives. I walked home in the rain that night, let it soak through my coat and into my skin like maybe I could rinse off the years of not knowing. But it stayed. That weight didn't lift. Back home, I sat in the hallway, the same spot where I'd found the letter. Everything felt smaller. Now, the rooms, the shadows, even the silence. But it was different too. No longer a wall I crashed against, but a mirror. I began speaking to people. Old friends of his, former co-workers. A woman who I suspected had once meant more to him than my mother ever did. Everyone had a version. No one had the whole. Still, the puzzle took shape. He hadn't been cruel, just absent, terrified maybe. A man who mistook silence for strength. Who thought that by not speaking he could keep the mess inside from leaking out. I used to think the silence meant he didn't care, that he didn't see me. But now I wondered, what if he saw too much? What if every word he didn't say was a way of protecting me from who he really was? That didn't make it easier, but it made it different. I started writing. Not a memoir, not even a journal, just fragments. Thoughts. Memories I was finally ready to face. I found myself whispering them aloud at times, like casting spells against the stillness. And in those fragments I found slivers of light, of something close to peace. Because sometimes, silence isn't absence. It's the echo of everything they didn't know how to say. There's a peculiar weight to confronting someone you love, not the heat of rage or the clarity of justice, but something softer, sadder. Like wading through fog that smells of old wounds. When I looked at my mother that night, really looked at her, it wasn't her age that startled me. It was the way her eyes flinched before I even spoke, like she'd been waiting years for this. Storm to break. I need to know, I said. She didn't pretend not to understand. Her mouth drew tight, her hands folded over themselves like they could hold her together. You think I didn't try? She said. Her voice was cracked ceramic. You think I didn't beg him to stay? I should have screamed, I think. Thrown. Something shattered a glass just to hear it break. But my anger had cooled into something denser, something sharp and steady. I told her about the empty spaces he left in me, about the nights I pressed my ear to the front door hoping for footsteps, the birthdays that felt like rehearsals for grief. She didn't cry. She just listened, which hurt worse somehow. The next day I went to the old ones, the distant uncles, the cousins who hadn't seen me since I was a boy with 2 big shoes and questions no one wanted to answer. Their truths came in fragments guarded by shrugs and cigarettes, coated in silence so thick I had to claw through it. I learned more from what they didn't say. He was charming, they said, troubled, brilliant, dangerous. And then, always that tight-lipped pause, like they were holding back a punch or a prayer. That's when it hit me. His absence didn't just haunt my past. It had shaped my now. Every relationship I'd ever touched bore the echo of a man who never stayed. I saw it in my fear of closeness, my skill at vanishing emotionally just before someone could leave me first. I wasn't just mourning him. I was mourning who I might have been if he'd stayed. There was a night, late, the kind of late when silence wraps itself around you like wet wool. When I sat on the back steps and asked the dark, "Who am I?" without his shadow, and the dark for once didn't echo back. I realized then that I'd spent my whole life in reaction to him, measuring my choices against a ghost, trying not to be him, and by doing so, still letting him shape me. But something changed in those long nights and brittle conversations. I started to see my mother not just as a woman who failed to keep him, but as someone who had been broken, too, and stayed. The nights she sat beside me, saying nothing, letting me fall apart without fixing it. Those became the truest things between us. Grief made us real, so I made a choice. Not a grand one, not loud. Just a quiet vow to end it. Here. I would not vanish, I would not leave questions behind. The cycle ends with me. The attic was suffocating. Not just from the dust and insulation clinging to the rafters like ancient cobwebs, but from something heavier, more deliberate. Like time itself had thickened the air, congealed around the things he left behind. Boxes, stacked like tombstones. Forgotten photo frames with faces turned inward as if they couldn't bear to look out anymore. I should have known I'd find something here. It was where he always went to be alone. I remember watching him from the stairs as a child, seeing his silhouette outlined against the attic light, motionless, his back straight like he was praying. But he never believed in God. The letter was inside a wooden box tucked beneath moth-eaten blankets. Not addressed to anyone. No date. Just his name scrawled on the outside in ink that had bled through the years. My fingers hesitated, but only for a moment. The paper was thin, yellowing, creased in 4 like he'd folded and unfolded it too many times. The words were precise. He always wrote like he was afraid the truth might spill if he wasn't careful. He wrote about fear. His, not mine, said he didn't know how to love the right way, that something inside him had been broken before I ever existed. He blamed his father, blamed silence, blamed war. But beneath the blame was regret. Coiled and trembling like an animal cornered, he wrote that he saw himself in me and couldn't bear it, that every time I smiled he saw the life he never lived. I don't know if I cried. I think I wanted to. But what came instead was a numbness, so clean and sharp it felt holy. He didn't ask for forgiveness, that was the worst part. He didn't even think he deserved it. I sat on the attic floor, knees to my chest, and thought about legacy. Not the kind lawyers talk about. Not money or property or the old watch in the drawer. The real legacy. The silence that trickled down through generations like a poison in the water. The anger that didn't have a name. The love that was always one room away but never opened the door. And my own life. How much of it had been shaped by the ghost of his choices? How many times had I flinched from love, expecting it to rot? There in the attic, I chose. Not with defiance or rage. Just quiet resolve. I chose to carry forward only what was mine. The questions he never answered could stay here, in the dust and shadows. But the strength I forged in his absence, that I would take with me, the clarity, the truth of who I had become because of him and despite him, and in that stillness I felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet. But the beginnings of hope, rising cautious and unsure, like a green shoot pushing through cracked pavement. Maybe it was enough. Maybe it always had been. It didn't happen all at once. Healing's not like a light switch. There's no click, no moment you can point to and say, there, that's where I turned whole again. It's messier, slower, a sort of unraveling, then a quiet reweaving. And it always starts with the one thing you've spent your whole life avoiding, telling the truth. The first time I spoke about him, really spoke, I couldn't meet my friend's eyes. I watched the condensation on my glass, the way it slid like rain down a window pane, and said, he left when I was 10, just walked out. Never came back. No one gasped. No one fell silent in awe of my confession. She just nodded, soft and slow, and said, that must have hurt. 3 words, that's all. And something shifted in me. Something old and brittle cracked just slightly at the edges. It got easier after that. Not easy, but easier. The therapist had that kind of voice that's designed to make you talk, like a song you can't quite tune out. I went in expecting nothing, left empty-handed the first few times. But then one afternoon I said it. Said it all. The late nights waiting by the window. The birthdays with untouched cake. The sound of my mother crying in another room. The ache of knowing he was out there, choosing not to care. And I cried. God, I cried like I hadn't in years. Not quiet tears, but raw, ugly sobs that gutted me from the inside out. She didn't interrupt. Just let me bleed. That was the day I realized the truth had claws. But it also had wings. It ripped you open, yes. But it also let something out. Later, I started writing it all down. Not for a book, not for anyone else. Just for me. And as the pages filled, I saw myself differently. Not the abandoned child, not the angry teenager, but the man who survived it. And then one night, after too much coffee and not enough sleep, I lit a candle and sat in front of his old chair, the one we never moved, never touched. I said his name. Out loud, I said mine. I told the empty room that I forgave him, not because he earned it, not because he asked, but because I didn't want to carry his absence like a curse anymore. I lit another candle, not for him, but for me, for the boy I was and the man I'd become. And I didn't cry. There was peace in that room, not loud, not triumphant, just a quiet knowing. Some scars fade, others stay. But I wasn't afraid of mine anymore. They were proof I'd felt something real, that I was still here, still breathing, still choosing life even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. It doesn't end, not really. The story just quiets down. The sharp edges dull, the colors fade. Some nights I still wake up with the weight of him pressing on my chest like a memory, turned physical, but the scream's gone. Now it's more of a whisper, a thread, a presence I no longer fight. The chair's still empty, but I've stopped looking at it like it owes me something. There are absences you learn to live beside, like ghosts that stop rattling the walls and start sitting quietly at the edge of the bed watching you breathe. I read his letter. Eventually. Not in some grand moment of catharsis, just one wet Tuesday when the rain wouldn't let up and the quiet inside me felt too loud. The words were stiff, careful, like a man writing with gloves on, afraid the truth might blister his skin. He didn't say sorry, not directly, but there were slivers of it between the lines. Regret disguised as explanation, fear posing as logic. I saw him clearly, maybe for the first time. Flawed, frightened, drowning in his own silences. That didn't fix anything, but it softened the edges. I went back to the lake, the one he used to take us to before everything turned brittle. I stood there for a long time, watching the water fold over itself, remembering the way he used to skip stones like he was trying to outpace something. I didn't cry. I just stood there, present, whole, in a way I hadn't been in years. There's peace in admitting some wounds don't close all the way. They scar, they ache when the weather changes, but they stop bleeding. I've made space for the silence now, for the gaps in our story that will never be filled. I don't chase explanations anymore. Some things happened, some didn't, and both matter. If you're still here, if you followed me through the mess and the grief and the unanswered questions, I want you to know this. Telling the story didn't make it pretty, but it made it bearable, and maybe, just maybe, it made me less alone. I hope it did the same for you because we all have our missing fathers, our unanswered calls, our locked doors and empty chairs. We all carry some version of a room no one walks into anymore. But naming it, giving it voice even if the voice shakes, that's the first step toward healing. Thank you for walking with me. Through the dark, through the silence, through the parts I didn't want to say aloud. If this story touched something in you, some memory you buried, some ache you never told anyone about, stay, breathe, speak. You're not alone. And if it feels right, leave a comment, share what you carry. Let's build a place where our broken pieces can sit beside each other. Not fixed, just seen. Less alone, less alone.